Under the blazing sun of the Arizona frontier, the wind carried the scent of dust, horses, and untold stories. The desert stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the distant cry of an eagle circling above the red cliffs. That morning, a wagon rolled across the rugged trail, its wooden wheels creaking under the weight of despair and fate. Inside sat a young woman, her wrists bound loosely with rope, her heart pounding harder than the hooves that carried her toward an unknown destiny. She had been soul-traded like a forgotten possession to a people she had only heard whispers about in the fearful talks of the settlers, the Apaches. And among them, a young warrior was waiting, fierce, proud, bound by his tribe's law to take her as his bride. She kept her gaze on the horizon, her mind drifting between fear and disbelief. Just days ago, she had been in the safety of her father's small cabin near the trading post, unaware that a single misfortune could change her life forever. Her father's debts had grown heavy, and when the men came, there was no mercy. The trade was made in silence. One glance, one nod, and her fate was sealed. She was told she would be safe, that the Apache warrior who had paid the price would protect her. But deep inside, she knew protection was not the same as freedom. The sun dipped low as the wagon reached the Apache camp. The sight before her stole the air from her lungs. Warriors stood tall and silent, their faces painted with streaks of red and black, eyes sharp as the desert hawks. Women and children paused from their evening chores to watch. The young warrior who stepped forward was unlike anyone she had seen. His long dark hair glistened with copper light, and his chest bore the scars of battle and pride. Yet his gaze held something unexpected. Not cruelty, but strength mixed with restraint. The chief spoke words she couldn't understand, and then, with a firm but respectful nod, the warrior approached her. He cut the rope from her wrists, but she didn't feel free. Not yet. The air in the camp was thick with tension that night. Fires crackled, shadows danced, and the sound of distant drums echoed through the canyon. She sat near the tent they said would be hers, now hers, and his. Her hands trembled as she touched the coarse blanket spread across the ground. She could hear laughter somewhere beyond the firelight, children's giggles, and the low hum of Apache songs, but in her heart there was only uncertainty. What kind of man was he? Would he treat her as property or as a person? The stories she'd heard from frightened settlers painted the Apaches as savages. But there was something in his calm that confused her. He hadn't spoken a single word to her since her arrival, yet she could feel his presence like a storm waiting beyond the ridge. The warrior sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, his eyes occasionally lifting toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. There was power in his silence. Every spark from the firelight carved his figure against the night, highlighting the roughness of his hands and the steady rhythm of his breathing. When he finally rose, she felt her throat tighten. He walked toward her, his steps measured, his eyes unreadable. Without a word, he extended a hand not as a captor, but as someone acknowledging another's fear. She hesitated, then slowly placed her trembling fingers in his. His touch was warm, firm, and surprisingly gentle. He said something in his language, soft and low. And though she couldn't understand the words, she felt the meaning in the tone. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The night grew colder, and the desert wind whispered through the tent flaps. He gestured for her to step inside, and she obeyed, uncertain and cautious. The interior was lit by the glow of a single oil lamp. Furs and blankets were spread neatly, and a small carved totem stood near the corner, as if guarding the space. She stood there, unsure of what to do. He followed her in, the tent flap falling shut behind him and closing them in silence. She could feel her heart beating wildly, the air thick with tension, and something she couldn't name, something that was not entirely fear. He moved closer, slow and respectful, his every gesture measured like he was trying not to startle her. When he reached for her arm, she flinched, and he froze instantly. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected in a warrior's eyes. Patience. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, as the two strangers shared the same air but spoke no words. Outside, the drums faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of the wind. She could hear the faint sound of his breathing, steady and calm. He didn't touch her again. Instead, he sat down across from her, resting his knife beside him, and stared at the lamp's flame like it carried his thoughts. When he finally spoke, it was in broken English, rough but clear. "No fear," he said quietly. "You safe here." Those two words struck her harder than she expected. Safe. It was something she hadn't felt in a long time. But even as comfort began to edge its way into her heart, confusion followed. Why would a warrior who could take anything by force choose to show restraint? Why did he, who had bought her, treat her as if she were something more than a bargain? The questions tangled in her mind, pulling her deeper into a silence she couldn't escape. The desert night was vast outside, the stars endless, and yet, in that small tent, the world felt too close to alive later. When he lay down near the edge of the blanket, facing away from her, she found herself watching him. The curve of his shoulder caught the flickering light, his breathing slow and even like a rhythm born from the earth itself. She wondered what kind of life had shaped him, what battles he had fought, what pain hid behind those calm eyes. And as the wind howled through the canyon, she felt something stir inside her, something unfamiliar. She wanted to understand him, even if fear still shadowed her thoughts, before sleep claimed her. She heard him murmur words in Apache, soft and rhythmic, almost like a prayer. The sound carried warmth, and though she couldn't understand the meaning, she sensed it wasn't meant to harm. That night, as she drifted into uneasy dreams, the memory of his voice followed her like a distant song carried on the desert wind. When dawn arrived, the world outside was painted in gold and rose. The camp stirred awake, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air. She sat up, still wrapped in uncertainty. He was gone, but his knife lay where he had been. Outside, voices called, and horses neighed, but her thoughts lingered on the strange calm that had settled over her. For the first time since being taken, she didn't feel like prey. Yet deep within, she knew something had changed. The night that was meant to be filled with fear had left her breathless for reasons she couldn't explain. And though nothing had been said, nothing had been done, the world between them had shifted. As the sun climbed higher, she stepped out into the light, the wind brushing her hair. The young warrior stood near the edge of the camp speaking with the elders. When his gaze met hers across the distance, quiet understanding passed between them, something that neither of them could name, but both could feel. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something powerful, something the desert itself seemed to recognize. And in that moment, standing between two worlds, her past and what awaited ahead, she realized that her story with him was only beginning. And what truly happened after that first night changed both their lives forever. The morning sun rose higher over the camp, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. The young woman stood near the tent, watching the Apache people begin their day. Smoke rose from small fires as women prepared food and children chased each other with laughter that echoed across the rocks. Life here was different, grounded, and bound by the pulse of nature. Yet every sound reminded her she was an outsider, a stranger among those who belonged. Her heart still carried the sting of fear, but it was mixed with a strange curiosity. Every face she saw held both strength and sorrow, as if the desert had carved its spirit into their souls. The young warrior returned to the camp shortly after sunrise. He moved with quiet authority, his steps light but firm, his presence commanding respect without words. When he saw her, he paused for a moment before speaking to one of the elders. She couldn't understand the Apache language, but the tone of their voices was calm, almost gentle. He then looked toward her and motioned for her to follow him. Unsure, she obeyed. They walked through the camp, past rows of tents and fires, till they reached the edge of the river that ran shallow between the rocks. He stopped there, pointing to the water, then to her. She hesitated, unsure what he meant, until he knelt and dipped his hands in the cool stream. When he splashed water on his face, she understood. It was a gesture of cleansing, a new beginning. Slowly she knelt beside him and did the same. The cold water felt like truth against her skin, sharp and pure. For a moment, they stayed there in silence, listening to the river. Then he spoke. his English rough but sincere. "No one hurt you here," he said, looking at her with steady eyes. "You live. You free?" The words confused her. How could she be free when she had been bought? Yet the way he said it made her heart falter. Freedom, perhaps, meant something different in his world. Back in the camp, the other women watched her closely. Some whispered, others smiled faintly, but none were unkind. An older woman brought her a bowl of food made from corn and herbs, warm and simple. When she tried to thank her, the woman only nodded. She didn't know if the kindness came from pity or acceptance, but it was the first moment she felt less alone. As the days passed, she began to observe the life around her more closely. The Apache people were disciplined and proud. Every task, whether it was tending horses, gathering firewood, or preparing food, was done with purpose. Children were taught early to respect the earth, to move quietly, to listen before speaking. There was a harmony here, a rhythm that seemed to guide them all. And at the center of that rhythm was him, the young warrior. He was not like the men she had known before. There was no arrogance in him, no desire to prove strength through cruelty. He led with silence and example, not with force. She often saw him training with the others, his movements swift and precise. Sometimes when the sun dipped low, he would ride out alone across the desert, disappearing into the horizon. He never said where he went, but when he returned, his eyes held the weight of something unseen, something that belonged to another world, the one of spirits, ancestors, and unspoken burdens. At night, she often lay awake inside the tent, listening to the drums and distant chants of the tribe. The firelight outside cast moving shadows on the tent walls, and she could see his silhouette as he sat by the flames. Sometimes he would carve small pieces of wood into shapes of animals, hawks, wolves, horses, and leave them near the entrance. She never asked why, but somehow she knew each carving meant something, a message left without words. One night she picked one up, a small wooden hawk, and ran her fingers along its wings. It felt alive, as if it carried the spirit of the sky. The next morning, she found him repairing a saddle near the horses. Gathering courage, she walked toward him and held out the carving. "You made this," she said softly. He looked up at her, surprised that she had spoken first. "For you," he replied, his accent heavy but his meaning clear. "Hawk see far. You learn. You strong." The simplicity of his words touched her more deeply than she expected. She didn't know why, but hearing him say she was strong made her chest tighten with emotion. Yet, not everyone in the camp welcomed her. Some of the younger warriors muttered among themselves, displeased that one of their own had taken a white woman as his bride. She noticed their looks, sharp as arrows, and their silence when she passed by. One afternoon, while fetching water, she overheard two of them speaking in low tones. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the tension in their voices. When she looked up, one of them met her eyes with something close to contempt. It chilled her that night. She asked him, her voice trembling slightly, "They don't want me here, do they?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at the fire. Then he said quietly, "Some fear what they don't know, but you not leave. You part now." The firmness in his tone silenced her doubts, yet the unease stayed. The world she had been forced into was not simple. It was beautiful and brutal all at once. Days turned into weeks, and she began to adapt to the rhythm of Apache life. She learned small words of their language, enough to greet, to thank, to understand. The older woman who had first brought her food became a silent teacher, showing her how to grind corn, how to weave simple cloth, how to braid hair with feathers for protection. Each gesture carried meaning, a piece of their world slowly shared with her, and though she still missed the sound of her own language, she began to feel a strange sense of belonging that frightened her as much as it comforted her. One evening, a storm rolled over the desert, thunder echoing between the cliffs. The camp hurried to secure tents and fires as rain poured down. Inside, the wind howled through the seams of their shelter. She sat close to the flame, shivering as he tied the flap to keep the wind out. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face, his expression calm despite the chaos outside. She felt a surge of fear, not for the storm, but for the world that had become her reality. When the thunder cracked again, she startled, and before she could think, he reached out, placing his hand gently over hers. "No fear," he said again, the same way he had that first night. And for reasons she couldn't explain, her heart steadied. After the storm passed, the camp gathered the next morning to repair what the wind had torn apart. The young warrior led the men to mend fences and gather scattered horses, while the women worked to rebuild fires. She joined them, helping to collect dry wood, earning nods of approval from some who had once only stared. Slowly, the air around her began to change. Whispers turned to greetings, suspicion to tolerance, but deep inside, she knew peace was fragile. Rumors began to spread of soldiers moving closer to Apache lands. The trader who occasionally visited the camp brought news of settlers demanding protection, of raids and retaliation. Fear began to settle like dust over the tribe. One night she overheard the elders speaking with him outside the tent, their voices low but urgent. She couldn't understand the words, but she caught the tone: worry, defiance, determination. When he entered later, his face was shadowed by something new. "Danger come," he said simply. "White soldiers, near river." Her heart sank. The thought of soldiers' men from her own people filled her with confusion. Would they see her as one of them, or as a traitor now? And what would they do to the Apache who had sheltered her? That night, sleep refused to come. The wind outside had turned still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. She lay awake, her thoughts tangled between loyalty and fear, between the life she had lost and the one she was beginning to understand. When she finally looked toward him, she found his eyes already open, watching the shadows move across the tent wall. He didn't speak, but the silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could. And as dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she knew something was coming, something that would test everything she thought she knew about trust, freedom, and the bond that was quietly growing between them. The peace of the desert morning was fragile, and in her heart, she felt that the calm before the storm had just begun. Word of soldiers near the river changed the air in camp. People moved with the same discipline, but there was an edge now, careful quiet as if every footstep might be heard from miles away. Riders left before dawn and returned at dusk with dust on their faces and a hard look in their eyes. Children practiced with small boughs near the mesquite, watched closely by mothers who kept glancing at the canyon rim. The young warrior spoke little, but his days stretched long. He sharpened arrows until his fingers grew red, mended leather straps, checked the horses, and slipped out to scout the dry washes and stone ridges that gave the Apache an advantage. He still kept the same gentleness with her, but his gaze had shifted from calm to watchful. She wanted to ask 100 questions but swallowed them, afraid the answers would make the danger more real. In those tense days she learned about the lines inside the tribe. Some wanted to move south deeper into the mountains. Others wanted to hold the camp and stand firm. A few spoke of trying to make peace with the soldiers, to trade and talk, believing that if the settlers were calm, the war talk might fade. She understood only fragments, but the faces told enough. The chiefs carried years of loss in their eyes. The younger warriors wore pride like armor, and they watched the horizon as if daring it to come closer. The young warrior, the man who had purchased her and refused to treat her like a prize, seemed caught between two paths. He listened to the elders with respect, but when he turned away, she could see his jaw tense, as if he carried a decision he could not share. The trader came again one windy afternoon, his mule loaded with cloth, metal tools, and gossip. He was a small man with a nervous laugh, but the tribe had used him for years to pass messages and barter without going near the forts. He greeted her with an awkward nod, surprised that she was still there. Near the fire, he told the chiefs what he had heard. The soldiers were not just a routine patrol. A new officer had arrived at the Fort App River, younger than most, eager to prove himself to superiors back east. He had promised the settlers he would stop the raids blamed on Apaches, whether or not the blame was fair. The trader lowered his voice when he said that some ranch hands, drunk and angry, had attacked a small group of Apache hunters near the canyon 2 nights ago. One of the hunters had not returned. Fear and fury moved through the listeners like a sudden wind. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the flames, thinking of how quickly a single reckless act could turn a valley to ash. That night, the young warrior sat with 2 others by the edge of camp. She could see their silhouettes and the quick motion of their hands as they argued in urgent whispers. She recognized one of them from the cold looks he had given her near the waterline. He favored the strong path, the path of striking first to show strength. The other was more cautious, reminding them of the children and the old ones who could not run if a storm of rifles came down the canyon. The young warrior did not raise his voice, but when he spoke, the others fell quiet. He was not the chief here, and yet his words weighed more than she expected. Finally, they rose, each going his separate way. She felt no relief. The next day, she followed the older women to the river to gather reeds. The work kept their hands busy and their minds from wandering. The women rarely asked about her life before, but one of them, the same elder who had welcomed her on the first day, began to speak. Her Apache words came slowly, and the younger women helped translate a little into the bits of English they knew. She told of a time when the people moved freely from the river to the high pines, when the hunters brought back elk, and the children learned the stories of the mountains from their grandparents by the winter fire. She told of hard years when soldiers burned food stores and forced them to walk in chains. She spoke without bitterness in her voice, but every sentence carried the weight of memory. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was high and her heart was heavy. She now understood that the word freedom meant something different here, because it had cost so much to hold even a small piece of it. At dusk, a scout returned with a broken arrow and news. Soldiers had set a camp on the north bank of the river, close enough to reach this valley by dawn if they wished. The new officer had a guide who knew the old trails. There were rumors he carried letters from settlers who wanted land cleared along the water. The elders gathered everyone. The plan was to be patient and avoid provocation. Fires were moved inside the trees. No songs, no drums. Watchers were posted in the rocks above. The camp felt like a held breath. Through all of this, a smaller conflict grew inside her that she hardly dared name. She had come here as payment for a debt. She had arrived fearing a life of domination. Instead, she found a man who never demanded, who treated her as a person, who offered her a hawk carving and space to breathe. Gratitude warmed into something deeper at odd moments and left her unsettled. It felt disloyal to the life she had lost, and yet that life had sold her. When she closed her eyes at night, she remembered her father's hand shaking as he signed the paper. The trader staring at the floor, the silence that followed. She wanted to hate these memories, but they were part of her. And so, standing between 2 worlds, she did what she could each day, chopping wood, weaving reeds, teaching the few English words she knew to children who begged for them. She tried to build a place where her heart could rest while the canyon waited for the next move. A new thread of tension entered the camp with the arrival of a young woman from a nearby band. She knew the warrior from childhood, and the moment her gaze fell upon the white woman, a sharp line formed around her mouth. She was not cruel, but she moved with a certainty that made others step aside. She was skilled with a horse, and quicker than most with a bow. She had survived years on the move, and her pride did not bend easily. When she spoke to the warrior, they used a distance that looked polite, yet the space between their words held old history. The white woman felt it like a cold draft. No one said they had been promised to each other, but whispers grew. If the tribe needed unity against soldiers, why had the warrior chosen this outsider instead of strengthening ties within the people? The question floated through the camp and settled behind every conversation. Another subplot took shape at the trading post. The trader, who had always tried to balance profit and peace, had a nephew who admired soldiers and wanted a job scouting. The nephew bragged that he could track an Apache camp by broken grass alone. The trader begged him to stay away, fearing he would feed trouble, but pride is stubborn. One evening, the nephew rode toward the river with 2 ranch hands. He wanted to prove himself. The next morning he returned with a cut on his cheek and a story about finding Apache sign near a cottonwood grove. Whether the sign was real or planted to frighten them, no one knew. Yet by sunset, his tale reached the fort. The new officer sent another column of men along the bank. In the valley, the war talk grew louder without a single shot being fired. Inside the tent, the warrior showed a different conflict. He was patient with her and firm with his men, but when he thought he was alone, she sometimes saw his hands tremble. He carried a small pouch at his belt. One night when the moon was bright, she saw him open it and press ashes to his fingertips. He touched the ashes to his chest, then bowed his head for a long time. She asked quietly what it meant. In halting English, he said it was from a sacred fire burned for a family member gone. He did not say who, but the ache in his voice told her it was close to his heart. The ashes bound him to a promise he had made, and that promise guided him more than the voices around him. She realized the young warrior's strength came from a place of grief as much as pride, and she wondered how grief would shape his choices if soldiers stepped into the canyon. The next dawn, a small figure appeared on the ridge, waving a strip of white cloth. It was the traitor. The warriors led him down the trail, and he spoke quickly near the center fire. He said the officer would meet a small party at the river bend to talk. The officer wanted to assure the settlers their cattle would be safe and to demand that missing items be returned. Several warriors scoffed because nothing had been stolen by this camp. The elder who had told stories by the river lifted her chin and said that talking might delay bloodshed. After long debate, the camp agreed to send to elders and the warrior. The young woman felt a cold knot in her stomach. Meetings like this could end with a handshake or with a trap. Still, no one in the camp wanted to give the soldiers a reason to move before they were ready. They rode out at noon. She watched from the ridge as the three figures moved through the bright sand, small against the wide sky. Across the river, glints of metal marked the soldiers waiting near cottonwoods. The officer was easy to spot. He sat straight on a tall horse, his hat crisp, his jacket clean. Beside him rode a civilian with a hard mouth who carried himself like a man who knew the land. She guessed the guide was either the nephew or someone like him, paid to tell the army where to look. The meeting lasted a long time. The men shifted and argued. At one point, the officer removed his hat and smoothed his hair like a boy playing at respect. Finally, the three Apache riders turned away and came back at a slow walk. That night, the camp heard the result. The officer wanted proof that the tribe had not stolen cattle or attacked the ranch hands. He insisted that they present a list of men and promised to count weapons. He demanded the return of a hunting rifle taken 2 years ago in a fight by another band miles away. He said if the tribe did not comply, he would come take what he needed to protect the settlers. The elders laughed without humor. There was no winning in such a game. If they agreed, the soldiers would find another excuse. If they refused, the soldiers would take their refusal as defiance. The choice was no choice at all. Pressure tightened. The younger warriors sharpened blades at the fire, their faces stony. The older women stacked dried meat near the canyon wall in case a fast leave was needed. Children were told to sleep with shoes on. The warrior said little, but he carried his bow everywhere, even inside the tent. He told her to keep the hawk carving close, as if a symbol could shield her when iron spoke. She wanted to be brave. She helped grind corn and braided hair and stood guard with other women when the men were away. She found a quiet courage in stillness. She also found a restlessness that felt like standing at a door that would not open. On the second night after the meeting, a shot cracked the quiet. One single shot from far off down the wash. The camp froze. Then a young boy came running, breath burning, saying he saw movement near the outer horses. The warriors scattered into the dark, silent as cats. She stood with the other women, heart hammering. Minutes passed like hours. A scuffle of feet. Then a rider burst from the shadows with a rope trailing. The horse bolted and snapped the line. Whoever had been creeping had fled into the rocks. In the morning, tracks showed 3 men with boots and a mule. They had tried to drive off 2 horses and failed. The soldiers would call it proof that the camp was dangerous. The camp would call it a warning that someone wanted to force a fight. As the sun rose, The warrior came to her with dust on his face and a new shadow in his eyes. He held out a small silver coin, the kind settlers used when they bought supplies at the post. He had found it near the tracks, shining in the moonlight like a signal. It was stamped with the year and the mark of the fort. She turned it over in her palm and felt its cold weight. The message was clear. Someone wanted to leave a trail that led straight to the Apache. Whether it was the nephew or the guide or a ranch hand who hated what he did not understand, she could not tell. The coin sat between them like a closing hand. By noon, smoke lifted faintly on the horizon near the river. A column of riders moved in and out of the cottonwoods, their outlines breaking and joining like a slow tide. The elders gathered one more time. The warrior stood at the edge of the circle, silent, until the oldest chief nodded to him. He spoke in Apache, voice like gravel. She could not follow all of it, but she knew he was asking for one more day to plan. One more night to move the children and the old ones into the narrow canyons where horses could not ride two abreast. He wanted the camp to disappear into the stone if the soldiers came. He would stay at the valley mouth with a few men and a line of decoys to turn any sudden rush. The elders agreed with slow, heavy nods. That evening she helped carry bundles up a steep path as the sky turned red. The older woman pressed a small bundle into her hands. Inside lay a strip of painted leather and a bit of dried sage. "Protection for travelers," the elder said with a tired smile. She tucked it into her dress and felt the sage crumble softly with each step. The path cut into a narrow crack where only one person could pass at a time. Children whispered, breathing fast. Far below, the warrior moved like a shadow across the valley floor, setting signs she could not read. When she reached the high shelf and turned to look back, the desert stretched wide and bright under the last light. It was a beautiful, harsh land, old as the stories carved in the elder's voice. A single hawk circled above the ridge, its wings steady. Somewhere out there, men with rifles and orders were following broken twigs and boot tracks they thought told the truth. The truth was here, in the quiet work of moving a people out of harm, in the lines on a warrior's face, in the beat of a woman's careful heart. The night waited between them all. And in that waiting, she felt the world tip toward something she could not stop. The sky turned crimson as the last of the sun dipped behind the cliffs. Shadows stretched across the valley, long and sharp like blades. The tribe had begun its quiet retreat into the hidden canyons, moving with the discipline of people who had done this too many times before. The women carried bundles on their backs. The children clutched their mothers' hands, and the elders whispered prayers to the wind. Every sound seemed to echo, even the crunch of a footstep on dry earth. She moved with them, her heart pounding harder with each turn of the trail. The young warrior walked beside her for a while, his bow in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't speak, but his silence was heavy with meaning. He was preparing for something final, from the ridge above. They could see faint trails of dust on the northern plain. Soldiers, the shapes of horses and rifles, gleamed faintly in the dying light. The army was moving faster than anyone expected. The traitor's warning had come too late. The officer was not waiting for proof or peace. He wanted victory. She gripped the hawk carving the warrior had given her, feeling its edges dig into her palm. It had once been a symbol of calm. Now it felt like a reminder that survival might come only with flight. The warrior ordered the scouts to watch from the high rocks, while he and a handful of men stayed behind to cover the retreat. He turned to her and said quietly, "You go with old ones. Safe place, in canyon. Wait for me." His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He didn't know if he would return. She wanted to protest, to tell him she couldn't leave him behind, but the words froze in her throat. His people needed him. If she begged him to go, she would make him choose between love and duty, and she couldn't do that to him. She simply nodded, her chest aching, and stepped back as he disappeared into the shadows with his men. Night came quickly. The canyon swallowed the tribe like a secret. Fires were forbidden, so they moved in darkness, guided only by moonlight. The older woman who had cared for her held her hand as they climbed the narrow path. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was clear, and far-off thunder rolled across the horizon. Somewhere down in the valley, A single gunshot cracked the silence, followed by another. The sound echoed off the rocks like a cruel reminder that time was running out. The younger children whimpered, and one of the women hushed them, her voice trembling. From the canyon rim, the young warrior crouched behind a line of boulders with 5 others. Below them, he could see the soldiers' campfires glowing like scattered stars. The officer had set up his tents near the riverbank, close enough to strike by dawn. They had wagons, rifles, and enough men to overrun the valley. But the Apache had the land on their side, and the warrior knew every turn of the rocks, every hidden pass where horses could not go. His plan was not to fight them head-on, but to delay them, to make them think the tribe had gone east while the people moved deeper south. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one that could save the children and the elders. Down in the canyon, she couldn't sleep. The cold air carried faint echoes of shouting, the sound of metal striking rock, and the distant rush of hooves. Each noise made her heart jump. The older woman sat beside her, whispering something she couldn't understand, but the tone was soothing. "He's strong," the woman said finally, in broken English. "He come back. Spirit walk with him." The words should have comforted her, but instead they felt like a prayer for the dead. Hours passed. The moon began to fade, and the faint light of dawn touched the canyon's rim. She could no longer stay still. Quietly she rose, clutching the carving, and started toward the narrow trail that led out of the hiding place. The old woman called after her, but she didn't stop. Every instinct screamed to turn back, yet her heart overruled her fear. She couldn't wait while he faced death alone. She climbed the rocks, her dress catching on thorns, her hands raw from gripping the stone. When she finally reached the ridge, the sight below stole her breath. Smoke drifted through the valley. The soldiers had fired into the brush, chasing shadows. A few Apache riders moved across the open ground, drawing the soldiers' attention away from the real path. Among them she saw him, the young warrior, his horse streaked with dust, his bow raised, his face lit by the morning firelight. He rode low and fast, leading the soldiers toward the far ridge where the land broke into ravines. But another group of soldiers was circling from the west, closing in faster than he realized. Her pulse hammered as she saw the trap forming. She knew he couldn't see the danger from where he was. Without thinking, she cupped her hands and called out a single sharp cry that cut through the wind. The sound startled the horses below. The young warrior turned sharply, his eyes finding her silhouette against the sky. For one frozen heartbeat, they stared at each other across the valley. Then he saw the soldiers closing in and understood. He jerked the reins, turning his horse sharply toward the riverbank. Shots rang out, echoing like thunder. Dust exploded around him as bullets struck the ground. She bit her lip to keep from screaming. One of the warriors fell, his horse tumbling into the sand. The others scattered into the ravines, drawing the soldiers' fire. The officer barked orders, waving his pistol, trying to control the chaos. In that confusion, the young warrior leaped from his horse, disappearing behind a boulder near the water. He signaled to 2 of his men, and they followed his lead. The officer, furious at being outmaneuvered, ordered his men forward. They charged toward the riverbank, firing blindly. The Apache arrows struck from behind the rocks, swift and silent. Horses reared, soldiers stumbled, and the sound of shouting filled the air. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her body trembling. She could see movement near the river, flashes of color between the smoke and dust. Then she saw him again, sprinting toward the water, a wounded soldier's rifle clutched in his hand. He fired once not to kill, but to break a wagon wheel that blocked the soldier's path. The wagon toppled, scattering supplies and slowing the advance. But the officer had seen him now. He raised his revolver and aimed. She didn't think, she only moved. Sliding down the rocky slope, she stumbled, fell, and caught herself again, the air tearing from her lungs. Her voice broke as she shouted his name, not in English, not in Apache, but in the only sound her heart could make. He turned at the last moment, the shot ringing out just above his shoulder. The bullet struck the ground behind him, spraying dirt into the air. He ducked, grabbed the reins of a loose horse, and galloped toward her direction. The soldiers tried to follow, but another group of Apache riders appeared from the hills. firing from a distance and drawing them back toward the river. The sky had turned gray, the storm clouds rolling in at last. Thunder cracked above them as he reached her. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his eyes wide with both relief and fury. "Why you here?" he shouted, his voice raw. She couldn't answer. She just reached for him, her fingers gripping his arm. He pulled her onto the horse without hesitation, and together they rode through the narrow path toward the canyon behind them. The battle raged on, but the storm quickly swallowed the sounds. Rain poured down, washing the blood and dust from the ground. The canyon walls shimmered with light as lightning tore across the sky. They rode hard, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the storm. The trail twisted between cliffs, the horse slipping on wet stones, but he guided it with steady hands. She could feel his strength through every movement, the determination that had carried him through countless battles. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, they saw the others waiting. The elders and women gathered around them, relief breaking into tears. The warrior dismounted first, helping her down. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing, the rain soaking through their clothes. The tribe had survived the night, but the soldiers would return. The storm had given them time, nothing more. As thunder rolled above, the young warrior looked back toward the valley. Smoke still rose faintly from the riverbank. He knew what had to come next. The tribe could not stay here. They would have to move deeper into the mountains, far from the trails where settlers roamed. But as he turned back to her, the tension in his face softened. She was safe. That was enough for now. The rain slowed, turning to a soft drizzle. The old woman placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding toward the warrior. "He fight for all of us," she whispered. "But he also fight for you." The young woman looked at him, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You saved them," she said quietly. "But you can't stay here." "They'll come again." He nodded. "We move tonight," he replied. "But first, rest." For a while, they said nothing. The storm had left the land silent, except for the gentle rush of water through the rocks. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the small hawk carving, handing it back to her. "You keep," he said softly. "Hawk always finds sky again." Her fingers closed around it, warm despite the cold rain. In that small gesture, hope returned to fragile, flickering light in the darkness. The world around them was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt that fate might bend toward something good. Yet even as calm settled over the canyon, the wind carried the faint echo of hoofbeats far beyond the ridge. The soldiers were regrouping. The final choice was yet to come, and the next sunrise would decide everything. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the valley washed clean and glistening under the pale morning light. The air smelled of wet earth and sage. Mist drifted between the rocks, curling around the trees like breath from a sleeping giant. The tribe began to move again, gathering what little they could carry. Horses were saddled quietly, and the children helped the elders pack baskets and hides. There was no panic now, only calm determination. They had survived the night, and that meant there was still hope. She stood near the edge of the canyon, watching the sky clear. The young warrior was below, tightening the straps of a horse. His movements were slower this morning, not from weakness, but from the weight of all that had happened. The battle at the river had changed him. It had changed them both. He looked up once, and when their eyes met, no words were needed. The bond between them had grown out of fear. But now it held something stronger: respect, trust, something deeper that neither dared to name aloud. By mid-morning, the tribe was ready to leave the canyon. The path ahead wound through the high ridges where the soldiers couldn't follow easily. The plan was to reach the hidden valley beyond the mountains, a place with water and grazing land where they could rebuild. It would be a long journey, but they were used to long roads and hard miles. As they prepared to depart, the older woman approached her and handed her a woven band made of deer hide and turquoise beads. "You wear this," she said softly. "It means you belong with us now." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She took the band and tied it around her wrist. "Thank you," she whispered. The simple gift carried more meaning than she could express. It wasn't just acceptance, it was forgiveness, maybe even a blessing. The young warrior rode ahead, scouting the trail as the others followed. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist and drying the ground. Birds called from the cliffs, and the land seemed alive again. She rode beside one of the younger women, sharing water and quiet smiles. The fear that had once ruled her was fading with each mile they put between themselves and the river. Every sound, the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves, the rush of wind through the canyon felt like a heartbeat of life returning. By evening, they reached a high plateau. From there, they could see the valley below, green with spring grass and dotted with willows. It was safe, untouched, hidden by ridges on all sides. The elders decided they would stay here for a time. Fires were lit again, small and warm, and the smell of roasting corn filled the air. The children ran freely, laughing for the first time in many days. The young warrior walked among his people, helping where needed, never seeking attention. He carried himself with quiet pride, the kind that came from knowing he had done right by his tribe. When she approached him, he smiled faintly, his eyes softer now. "You strong?" he said. "Not many walk through fear and still stand." She looked at him, remembering the girl she had been when she first arrived, the one who had trembled in a wagon, believing her life was over. That girl was gone. "You taught me how," she replied gently. "You showed me what strength really means." They walked together near the river bank that wound through the new valley. The sound of running water filled the silence between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "This place will be home. My people stay. You can go if your heart wants another path." She looked out at the mountains, their peaks catching the last light of the sun. She thought of the settlements she had left behind, of the trading post, of faces she once knew. There was nothing waiting for her there anymore. Here, among these people who had risked their lives for one another, she had found something she hadn't known. She needed a sense of belonging. "My home is here," she said quietly. "With you?" He said nothing, only nodded once, but she saw his shoulders ease, the tension that had lived in him since the first night softening at last. The hawk carving still hung around her neck. He reached out and touched it lightly, his hand brushing hers. "Hawk always finds sky again," he murmured, and she smiled. That night, the camp was peaceful. The stars stretched wide across the sky, brighter than she had ever seen. The people sang softly, their voices carrying through the cool air. She sat by the fire, watching the young warrior speak with the elders. The old woman sat beside her, weaving reeds into a mat. "He carried big spirit," she said. "You make him see peace again." "Maybe he gave me peace too," she replied, and the woman smiled. Days turned into weeks. The new valley slowly became a home. The people built shelters near the water and planted small gardens along the riverbank. Horses grazed freely on the slopes, and the sound of children's laughter once again filled the mornings. She learned more of their language, their songs, their ways. She helped gather herbs, stitched clothes, and even taught the little ones simple English words. The women began to trust her completely, and when one fell ill, she stayed at her side all night, helping in any way she could. The bond that had begun with caution had grown into something unbreakable. The young warrior often left at dawn to hunt or scout, returning at sunset with food or news from the outer ridges. Sometimes when he rode in, the children would run to greet him, their laughter echoing across the camp. He would look at her across the fire, and their eyes would meet in quiet understanding. They didn't need to speak about what they had endured. The silence between them carried everything that mattered. One afternoon, the trader appeared again, riding slowly into the valley with his mule. He was older now, thinner, and his voice carried a tremor when he spoke. "The soldiers are gone," he said. The officer was recalled. "The fort's been closed. Folks up north are tired of fighting." He looked around the camp, his eyes filled with surprise and a hint of guilt. "You all did what no one thought you could. You survived." The elders thanked him for bringing the news. The young warrior stood nearby, arms crossed, watching but saying little. The trader then turned to her, his expression uncertain. "You could come back if you want," he said quietly. "The settlers would take you in. They'd understand." She smiled faintly. They wouldn't understand, she said. Not really. I'm where I'm meant to be. The trader nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. When he rode away, the valley seemed brighter. As summer warmed the land, life returned fully. Crops sprouted, the river ran clear, and the fear that had hung over them faded into memory. The young warrior became one of the tribe's respected leaders, known not just for his strength in battle, but for his fairness and wisdom. The people began to call him the man who listens before speaking, a title of honor. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold and red, he led her to the high ridge overlooking the valley. The wind brushed their faces, carrying the scent of wildflowers. When I first saw you, he said quietly, you were afraid, but you stayed. You learned. You made my people see a new way. You gave me reason to fight for peace. She looked up at him, her heart full. You gave me back my life, she said softly. I thought I was lost, but you showed me that even after being broken, we can start again. He reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing. The world around them was silent, except for the steady hum of the evening wind. Below them, the fires of the camp flickered like stars scattered on the earth. For the first time, she felt truly at home, as darkness settled. The hawk soared above them, wings spread wide against the fading light. She watched it until it disappeared into the horizon, free and unafraid. It felt like a sign, the end of their long struggle, and the beginning of something new. The next morning, life in the valley carried on. Children chased each other through the grass. Women sang while grinding corn, and men repaired their tools for the coming harvest. She stood beside the young warrior near the riverbank, the same place where they had once stood as strangers. Now, the water reflected their faces side by side, calm and clear. She turned to him with a smile that carried no fear, only peace. The world feels different now, she said. He nodded, his eyes warm. Because we changed it, he answered, and as the river flowed quietly past them, the wind carrying songs of life and renewal, she knew that the story that had begun with fear and captivity had become one of love, strength, and freedom. The desert had tested them both, but it had also healed them. In its silence, they had found their home, and in each other, they had found something that would never be lost again.